Hello, everybody. Welcome back to TARTLEcast. I can't even keep my cool here with Tanya. She's making me crack up. By the way, I was dying when I was reading your book. I could really feel the flavor of your personality through the writing, which I typically find rare for a lot of authors. They become very stiff when they write. They're really trying to force a message across, but I think it has to deal a lot with your playwright skills. So, first of all, thank you for coming on. Thank you for the joy. Thank you for moving to New Mexico. I mean, that's a huge bonus. I mean, somebody's making some good decisions here.
Yes.
Talk about being a disruptor.
We don't want to talk about New Mexico too much.
No, I know. That's not what it's about. But Tanya, you have creatively trespassed into this geography of the United States. You have creatively trespassed into our mind. And I would love to discuss your against the grain attitude, perspective, individuality, and how that's actually brought you to, I would say, a very special point in life where you can share that knowledge and the success of that sort of individuality with others in the workplace. So thank you very much for writing this, and thank you for coming on.
You're welcome. Thank you, Alexander and Jason. The bearded man in the room.
He is the bearded man in the room. What was that? Batista?
She said I'm wearing a dress earlier. That's what we were laughing about. That was the funniest shit ever.
Have you seen a girl in a dress?
Oh, you look cute in a dress, Jason.
You would look good in a dress.
We'll have to do that on an episode.
I wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
As long as you're cool with it.
No, I don't care.
Okay, perfect.
Cool.
So I can't even concentrate.
I feel like we're like on a morning radio show in Phoenix, Arizona.
No, that's exactly.
You look great on a dress, Jason. Shut up, Alexander. Yeah. Oh my God. Okay, we're just gonna.
Our drivers are half asleep, but they're listening to us just because it's the only thing on air. You know what I mean?
Oh, that's funny.
Okay. So I need to understand something here.
Talk to me.
I spent some time in theater building stages.
Oh, cool.
I wasn't the actor. Mm-hmm. I watched the actors. Mm-hmm. I watched the group, the collective, the individuals coming together and creating that theater tribe, right? All black, add the plaid. You know what I'm saying? You know, I've seen it all from Jesus Christ Superstar to, actually, I don't even know. There's tons. We did plenty of them. And I was always shining the spotlight on these individuals. But they really do shine in that individuality. And even though they're playing the role of an actor on stage, there's still so much of their own personal character that comes through in that role. And when I look at that bridge, and also congratulations for making it through cancer. Like, cheers to you. That's a huge supportive thing, and I want to share that to people out there. Yes, it is possible. And Tania integrated with an understanding of something that was happening in her life, and she achieved an overcoming of it. So congratulations.
I lucked out. Go on.
To continue past that, right? When you look at theater, it reminds me a lot of office culture. And I think that the bridge that you made in creative trespassing over to the function of your job in the office is everybody has a role to play. Mm-hmm. The question is, do you sit within the confines of that specific role, or do you add the nuances of you that makes you special as that actor? Because those are the things that lead people to get the Oscars, get the Grammys, right? To find themselves on Broadway. So when you're creating that Broadway at work, do you think that's where that transition actually happened? It was like a perfect metaphorical carryover for you? Is that what that was?
Well, I think because of what my training was in theater, like the foundation for theater is suspension of disbelief. So really, the foundation is about leaping from the foundation. It's about deciding collectively that we're going to, enter theater space, and we're going to let go of all of our assumptions and perceptions about the world as we know it and take a gigantic leap of faith into the unknown together. And when that's your foundation for making, then you are creating worlds, and you have permission to create entire worlds from nothing. I mean, from theater, you have like a blank a blank script to start with, a blank page, and then a writer writes, and then you have an empty stage. You don't have props or anything, and then you bring together this beautiful collaboration of human beings, of somebody who aims the light, somebody who says where the light should be aimed, of somebody who stands in front of the light and says, "Oh, it's hitting me just right." And so that was my training foundationally, which at first, when I went to Arizona State University and did get my degree in playwriting specifically, and I was being produced in around the country as kind of a young adult. And so I went into the world and I'm like, that's my profession. I'm going to get paid a lot of money to write plays. And then I got a job working in theater development, and I realized, A, I wasn't getting paid a lot of money, and B, I didn't find that this skill that I had developed as a writer was being necessarily celebrated, because I had to, enter in the donations into an Excel spreadsheet. And so I started to see this discord of like this wonderful skill I'd been taught, and actors and lighting designers and all this, and then what we actually did and got paid for. And so I ended up bouncing around to a lot of seemingly disparate jobs, right, outside of theater. So, I bagged groceries,
Barista.
I did barista telemarketing. What's that? That's when we make things up and we get your credit card number. It wasn't my fault.
That.
It was my boss's.
Yeah.
But what I also discovered in these seemingly disparate jobs is that I inadvertently inserted the stuff I'd learned from theater to keep myself entertained, to keep my colleagues entertained, to enliven these weird, rigid processes in a way that made us feel like more alive. So when I was bagging groceries, for example, it would be like, okay, how many grumpy customers can we make smile today? Let's go. Or like a bagging competition. These were all unofficial things, again, to make us feel like what we were doing wasn't drudgery, was not for nothing. So in essence, I was connecting to an audience. It's like, oh, the audience is grumpy. How do we perk them up?
Exactly.
The audience just happened to be people online waiting to bag their groceries. So that was kind of like the inception. Then as I got more conscious about this creative trespassing that I seem to be doing, and I was speaking about creativity in the workspace, people would come up to me after I'd speak at major companies that I felt like I didn't belong in. I'm like, I guess I'm just an ancillary creativity speaker, but they would come up to me afterwards at Expedia and Etsy and all these places and say, I have a degree in theater too, or, I like to dance on the weekends or this. And, it was almost like they were speaking in hushed tones, like they had left off the theater, the dance, the stuff that really enlivens them. They'd left that off their resume and out of their job, and therefore their job seemed more like drudgery than whatever they did on the weekends. And so I'm like, this is a problem. If we're all here and we're spending more than 40% of our time, sometimes even 65% of our time at work, why the hell aren't we bringing the crap that enlivens us outside of work into our work day? And so then I started to do both physical research and real scientific research about what it meant to bring more creativity into less overtly creative and transformative spaces, processes, and work cultures. And people seem to really dig it. So that's where the inception. Yeah.
I feel like if you walked into one of the trading floors on Wall Street, they would have a panic attack. Jimmy Diamond from he'd be having a nosebleed if you walked into their office. So here's what I want to ask you then, and this will lead us to some further points upon this. Some workplaces are quite toxic. And these are the thoughts I had when I read your book. And some environments are ones that are actually quite sterile, and job processes really end up defining the culture rather than the culture defining the job processes. Is it still possible to carry that sort of creative trespassing? And he used the word trespassing, which is strange, because trespassing says that somebody else owns that border of the area that you're walking into, and you're pushing through it illegally, but a positive gain comes from it, which I think is quite interesting. So if say the environment is toxic, say it is, or sterile in terms of the culture or things of that nature, or it's just a manufacturing environment, does this sort of processy here, this creative trespassing, still work in those environments?
Well, first of all, you bring up a good point. The inception or idea of the name creative trespassing is, at some point people would ask me over and over again, like, what do you do? Why are you working at this tech company? Or like, why are you speaking at a manufacturing conference? Like, and I'm like, I'm creative. I'm the,
Right.
I'm a mascot for fun. I didn't know how to adapt a rigid notion of being in those spaces because I wasn't. And so then I'm like, okay, what I'm doing is creative. And then I'm like, well, what am I doing with that creativity? And what are all these people who, are dancers and theater practitioners and who kind of sneak in that creativity? Well, we're trespassers, as your point, Alexander. We're going into spaces and places and work cultures that didn't necessarily like invite us in through the front door.
Right.
And now that they see the skills that we are infusing, they realize we're adding layers that weren't there before, and now they can't live without. So that's the foundation for this idea that I came up with, creative trespassing. So to your point, and I love that you went to like finance, because always, whenever I'm speaking at like a global company, it's always some accountant who raises their hand and says, "But what about accounting? Could you be creative in accounting?" The big challenge.
Yeah, cook the books. That's creative.
Yeah, but I have two responses, and here's really. The response I say to them is not cook the books, but if whatever you need to do, whatever you need to do. But is actually you can be rigid about it. If you can't find $10,000, you could be like, well, I have my Excel spreadsheet, I have all these processes, or you could be like, I'm going to look at the receipts and I'm going to conjure the memory of that lunch I went to with Alexander, and we actually talked about what it means to be an entrepreneur, what it means to be in finance, and we found you could do it, you could find the money in a lot of ways. But secondly, there are two C's in creativity. There's the big C of creativity, which is like painting, dancing, theater, blah, blah, blah. But there's also the little c. And this has been proven. There's a really good study that was done in the 90s. I won't go into it. Patricia Stokes, you can look it up.
Okay.
But basically it proved, it was a seminal study, that we all have an innate ability to solve practical problems in new ways. And that is creativity. That's the little c. Every human being, and it was actually tested with rodents. And if you believe you're a little smarter than a rodent, which I do.
Jason?
Yeah, Jason. Oh my God, Jason's like, for those who can't see, Jason has a questioning look on. No,
he's a rodent. Looks like a gorilla that's in a dress.
You're my new best friend. Perfect. So it proved that we all have this ability. And so it's a skill like any other that we can choose to develop or not. So that's what I say. So in terms of toxic culture as a whole, different, there's a lot of top-down leaders. There's leadership. There's a lot of, I worked at a company that was quote unquote flat management, which just meant that you could do stuff until they're like, that sucks. And then they cut it off, or until the CEO's like, oh yeah, be free. And then at some point the CEO would be like, oh yeah, okay, free. Oh no, it's going to be my idea. And you're like, wait, how come it's always your idea?
It's always your idea. Yeah. You egotistical prick. Like, are you kidding me?
I did this with Google, and this was really interesting. They have a whiskey room. I don't know if you've heard about this.
I'm
so they
not
have
setting that up for you.
What?
I think we need to set this up. But they have all the most expensive whiskeys in a room. And so they encourage teams when they're stuck, if they drink alcohol, to go into this room. And they have big beanbag chairs and stuff like that. And they actually drink whiskey and sit there and they talk about the problem.
I'd be wondering where you and Tania
they microdose, psilocybin. They do all these different things. The Gmail team said that they came up with Gmail off of psilocybin. So how do you get like a Google? How do you they're encouraging alcohol abuse at
well, first of all,
the workplace? 9 to 5. Like, it's a 9 to 5 job. I mean, Google's not 9 to 5. You can work there at 2 o'clock in the morning, but it's like, hey guys, go have some alcohol. Figure this problem out. How do you get? Because you said normal is where creativity goes to die.
Yeah.
So, how do you get
alcoholism is where creativity goes to AA. I mean,
alcohol comes, your prefrontal cortex.
Here we go.
It moves that away. You have more lateral thinking, the ability to lateral think. We know that. Yeah. They've done studies on alcohol where if you're at like a 0.08, then that's when what was the
Hunter
writer?
S. Thompson.
Hunter S. Thomas, he did some of his most creative work. Stephen King said, he couldn't, unless he was drunk, he couldn't write. And I'm not an advocate for alcohol. I'm just saying, how do we get how do we transform the norm?
Okay.
Well, but also, what you're talking about is alcohol as like a nudge to be free within your
Yes.
thinking. And yes, alcohol is one way to get there, maybe, but not for all people. Also, I think that's like this could be hashtag white privilege. Just go
Yeah,
into
exactly.
a room. We've got fancy booze and you can drink it. Okay. Like what the, like,
Right. I see what you're saying.
and so what I am saying is that creativity, I'll go back to it, is a skill like any other. And so think about, Jason, like a skill that you possess, and think about you getting into a moment where you feel stuck or like you're blocked. If a choice can be drinking alcohol, fine, or it can be pushing through. And actually, any creative person who's listening, and by creative, I mean anybody who's had to solve a problem, that when you stay the course and push through and not actually shift gears and drink alcohol, or shift gears and get away from the problem. When you push through and sit there and go, you know what? I know this is uncomfortable, and there's a reason why, because I'm at a moment of breakthrough. You will break through.
Creativity always comes in those moments of, like, you can see like the blue paintings with Picasso when he was super depressed.
Yeah.
I mean, if we really look at, because I want to shift the podcast in this direction. We're going to go
I know
there.
where you're going.
Yeah, he knows where I'm going, because this is what I want to talk to you about. Is there are people that are out there in workplaces that are either, on the spectrum of creativity, maybe really high, and they're lost. Like, if they're sitting at Goldman Sachs wearing a tie right now, they're like, I want to jump out this window.
And some
and they do, and they
Yeah.
think about that constantly, because creative, a lot of creative people are almost, I don't want to say they're a different species, because I don't want to, but it's a whole different diagram. And I don't think managers, leaders, C-suite handles creative people very well. I mean, you get a super creative introvert, you have an amazing person there, an absolutely amazing person, but yet, how do you handle that? How do you handle their mood swings? How do you handle them being late constantly?
How do you open them up?
Yeah. How do you
let the creativity flow?
Do you see where I'm saying?
Yeah. But also, in fairness, there is sort of like this mystique or, like mythology about creative people, and as a, like a grouping of people who, and really there, you could go, granular and say, well, some people who possess, like the big C of creativity, maybe are dealing with some mental illness. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, we can't put a blanket on this idea of like, our artists are temperamental, or artists need this or that. Some artists need that, just like,
all great art and music.
Hey, listen,
off of that.
But I've met.
Tanya's about to snap. Don't say anything.
Yeah, but I mean, I've met plenty of CEOs and like CIOs and all the I and the O's and the E's and the C's and the V's and the P's who, possess all that sort of erratic and lovely and magical and shitty, ways of being in the world. So I don't buy into that mythology. I do what you're saying in terms of having leadership not understand the visionaries hiding right under their noses, the creatives that they can tap into for the big campaigns or ideas. I totally agree with you that there are lots of situations like that. Then we get into a whole conversation about ego, and also there's another practice other than drinking called meditation. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this, but
Tanya,
yes,
we just had Ethan Cross on the other day. You would have had a freaking blast with this guy. He wrote Chatter.
Oh, yeah.
And you're talking about this focus on these things that make you uncomfortable. And whether it be meditation or a methodology he has for finding that focus, that is that catalyst for creativity. And so when you talk about this little C, fear is a massive blocker. How do you afford somebody in a workplace? And then I'm going to make the larger macro.
This is chapter 1.
Yeah.
Fear last year.
Right. And fear is last year. How is it that they can unlock the little C for practical problems, but not worry that every freaking outcome from them trying something is going to end up in their demise?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
a few different ways. One is to make bad work, and actually, I write about it.
Correct.
Yeah, correct. I love it. Like
No, I mean, like, it's right here.
like the
Yeah.
certainty is so. I love it. Yeah, and so sometimes we put artificial stakes, like we raise the stakes of the situation, because our boss is very demanding and maybe yelling at us or like putting exclamation points on that you need to finish this, and so we absorb that, and we're like, oh shit, and then we get trapped in a fear swirl or a doom circle, as I like to say, a doom spiral. And then instead of producing our best work, we are producing our worst work. So I say, cut the middleman, do your worst work. These are the situations where we're already jumping to, I'm going to fail, I'm going to be fired, da, da, da. Instead of jumping to that, stay still and say, I'm going to just do the worst work I've ever done. And there's a freedom in that. And I've found in people that I coach and work with, embedded in companies, find it's like, oh, actually, now I've produced something weird and wonderful and actually useful to the task at hand. So that's the first thing. And then another thing, Alexander, which I'm sure both you and Jason know, is we're a bunch of overachievers or high achievers, right?
Yeah, we are.
And a lot of people who feel that fear of failure, and so they don't even start, are also high achiever. And so what we do is we're like, okay, I want to do everything, and I want to do everything right, and I want to be perfect, and da, da, da. And then what happens is we get stuck in overwhelm, and we end up doing nothing. And so the solve for this every single time is something I say to my coaching clients is, instead of doing no things, do one thing and celebrate it. And so those tiny incremental actions actually add up to something significant. So for leadership, for example, if you're like a leader in a company and you're like, I know creativity is supposed to be something and we have to pivot, everybody's like creativity, innovation, but I don't know. It's like, just do something every single day. It can be a 10-minute engagement with your teams on some sort of creative pursuit, some sort of brainstorming that has you're not invested in the results. You're invested in the process, in allowing people to have personal agency and allowing people to shine, So these, and as a marathon runner myself, I didn't set out and like one day I'm like 26.2 miles, bam. I had to train for my first one for a year, and I would run like 1 mile on Monday, 2 miles on and incrementally built up so that towards the end I was running 17 miles with ease. And then when I showed up to run 26.2 miles, that's insane. I was able to do it because I had trained. Writing Creative Trespassing, writing an entire book. If I sat down and like, I'm going to write it in 2 seconds, and then I've been practicing my whole life writing. And then with this book, I would write a chapter in a week and I'd send it to my agent or my editor. And then I'd be like, and then I'd write another one and I wouldn't look back at her notes and I would just continue onward. So this is all like, think about any behavior you've ever changed, and did you do it overnight? And if you went into the whiskey room, did that take you off track for a little bit? And then you know what I'm saying? Sometimes we all go to the whiskey room and then we're like, oh shit, I need to leave that room, lock it, and go on my real path. So
right.
Yeah.
Can we stop derailing here for a moment and do something productive?
The reason I brought that up is because mainly for leaders, because we have a lot of leaders of companies that listen to us, 222 countries. It's like, how do you make something creative? Like, how do you take this sterile environment that you're in and create a Google or create some of the companies that you mentioned earlier? How can you, how do you bridge that as a leader?
Yeah, one thing actually that when I was giving a talk and workshop for Expedia a few years ago, one of the issues that it was for their global engineer team, and one of the issues that they were facing, and this is like pre-pandemic, was they were feeling disconnected from their teams who were overseas, right? You guys are sitting together in the same room and there's an energy and like a generative quality to being side by side and figuring out, solving problems. And they were like, oh, I know we have video, but like, And so we dug a little bit deeper and I'm like, well, I guess, as a company, Expedia like deals with travel, right? Like they travel, they go overseas, they take.
Why don't you travel there?
Well, so I'm like, well, what would be a really cool way to communicate with your, like let's disrupt this thing, the video. And so anyway, what we came up with, and actually I write about it, yay, is writing. So they became, I was like, why don't you become pen pals with these people and write a physical letter, instead of like going their hyper tech company, like let's get analog on the situation. Let's, what if we could turn it all around? And so they started, being pen pals. And I don't know if you guys remember or still have like letters that come to your mailbox, and how exciting it is to open it up and feel the paper that somebody's chosen and look at their handwriting and see how they purposely put words on paper. And
Well, I
they
mean, that's
loved
why
it.
we
Yeah.
choose this. We always go with the physical book.
Yeah.
I think there's a different connection that happens here with your synapses, and I'm pretty sure that's proven. I love the fact that I can get it as an ebook, and I can buy it with one click. But having this here in front of me, something tangible, allows me to create a relationship with the book, which I think is a lot different. And having a relationship with your coworkers, with your
Yeah.
creativity, with the culture is the thing that starts to define the difference in how you work with that material.
Yes. And also, I want to give you a follow up, to what, here's a group of engineers. I mean, there were like, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of engineers. And so, you talk about people kind of freezing up at high levels within corporations, like leadership about like, oh my God, what are we going to do with these unhinged engineers now? But actually the person who brought me in said that the engineers were so excited that they started to think about disrupting all of the technologies, not in a way that was harmful, but in a way that elevated what they were already doing. So really it triggered some deep creativity that had been latent and not really like, this is a focus, creativity. And ironically, a lot of the companies that I've been speaking with and consulting with in pandemic times, were the ones that scaled pretty quickly based on being innovative and creative. And that was the first thing to go when they started to scale. Like the thing that brought people to these companies was the thing that once they started making money and that they let go of. And so back to leadership, it's a practice and a process. And if you do not invest, just like any software you use, it's like a CRM, but only the C is creativity, it's something you invest in software and you're not like, oh, it sucks or it's hard, I'm going to give it up. You're like, no, this is going to help my clients. This is going to help our teams. This is going to help us scale. That's the same thing with creativity.
So this is brilliant. Kudos to you. We have data champions all over the world, ones that listen to the podcast and ones that actually interact with the data marketplace. We talk about disruption in the workplace. Is it possible for individuals in all these countries, and countries carry culture, to be disruptive in a positive, creative sense for the greater good of themselves and their country and everybody else that they're in relations with outside of it? Does this format still work for an individual in their country, in their family, in their household?
Yes. I think that when thinking about disruption, obviously it can mean lots of things. It can mean something, just like anything else. Creativity could be used for good, or it could be used for evil. And
Yeah.
same with disruption. At the end of the day, all of the disruption that I've done as an individual and as a collective or collaborative or working with a company is we are focused on the mission and vision of what we're trying to do. And so and by disruption, my definition of disruption is applying a question that all of us artists learned early on. And that question is, what if? And that allows for possibilities beyond this space and time. Like, what if instead of us using technology, we sent letters in the mail? What if, what if going to work meant feeling alive? What if being in our household meant we took strategies and tactics from work that work and applied them to communication within interpersonal relationships? What if? So to that point, again, this is, being in the world in a way that you're practicing seeing what isn't just in front of you, but what the context is, how that impacts other human beings, how that has a ripple effect. I mean, that is, that's the big C of creativity. Those of us who've trained in dance or theater or music or whatever, we don't just think about the music we're making. We think about who's showing up to the show. And
Right.
we're thinking about what we want, how we want them to feel once they're there, and how we want them to feel and act once they leave the theater or leave the bar or whatever. And so that consideration is something that if we, again, a lot of companies, especially if they're not thinking or really connecting to, like T-shaped skills or collaboration or just stretching across departments, disciplines, and ideas to actually bring in outside ideas into the inside, then we're really just perpetuating like a myopic way of thinking. And there's where we get into trouble. And, obviously there's been a lot of, we've talked about in corporate culture, like diversity and inclusion in a very like sterile way for a long time.
Yeah.
And so diversity happens in lots, cultural diversity, diversity in age, in thinking, in thought process, neural diversity. And really when we invite in all of those perspectives to the table to solve problems, we will solve problems. Otherwise, we're just literally spinning our own wheels.
So then the way I look at this from your framework is that 7.5 billion people, if they come together as all these little C's doing this small creative thing, all of us, just a 1% change in adaptive practical thinking, and being that individual, we can actually come together to create something large, a big C, something very beautiful for the world as a whole. And if I understand this, just because we come together as a collective to do things as a group in unity, it doesn't mean we have to suppress our individual identities. You can have a collective of identities that can still maintain who we are, as Jason in the dress, Alexander in the hat, Tanya as the totally wild against the grain human being. We can still do things amazingly together and solve the world's problems practically if we begin to trespass on these cultural ideas that we think are so rigid and finite that are actually limiting us from being true human beings. And I think this is a really phenomenal message that is so much stronger than just the workplace culture. I think this can actually really expand to everybody across the globe so we can really find a foundational change that is better for all of our futures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I feel like we're going to create this creative trespassing collective after this podcast.
I love it.
Yeah. And, you're reminding me of a moment in which I as a collective with a tech company came up with a big idea to see, hear, and celebrate women in technology and in the world, and and it was a moment, to your point, Alexander, where a lot of times the things that are most important to us as human beings get sidelined in workspaces, get sidelined in the home, get sidelined in places of worship. And really, at the end of the day, as humans, we just want to be seen, heard, and celebrated. And I don't mean that in huge like parades. I just mean that as a human who's contributing to fellow humans and being in the world. And so that was the impetus and for starting the creative or the It Was Never Addressed campaign. That
On the bathroom sign.
yeah. So and I'll just talk a little bit about that because it really was a moment where it was a problem nobody was looking to solve within our company. So I was working at a software company. Axosoft, had no prior experience, didn't care about software. I thought it was a cashmere sweater. It's not. It's a technology that's boring AF to me at the time. And so I literally was hired as like an evangelist, and I'm like, wait, I'm not a religious zealot. Why did I take this job? This totally sucks.
Yeah, I'm Jewish. We have
That's
our own
right.
little tribe and we keep quiet. Like, come on.
That's right. Yeah. So I started working at this software company and literally didn't know anything. But I wanted to take a risk, and I thought it was an awesome challenge. And so second month on the job, my boss came to a colleague, Sarah, and myself and said, we're going to host a big women in technology company, and I want to show up in a big way. So like, come up with a big idea. And this is 2015 when, you know, the Ellen Pao trial was going on. A lot of, there wasn't clear pipelines or invitations to women being in technology, even though there were a lot of women who were qualified. And once they were there, it was so sort of like bro culture that it was like, how okay, diversity, but where's the inclusion part? Like, I'm going to leave. So like the churn rate was high. It was kind of yucky. And so I started thinking about women in technology and women in most spaces. And, how oftentimes we're not seen, heard, or celebrated for the superheroes we are, or just our daily contribution. And how can we kind of disrupt that? Long story short, the one thing I landed on was the symbol of the women's bathroom sign. So, you know, she got a triangle dress.
Love it. Yeah.
Circle for a head. She hangs out in the place where you want to pee.
Always watching you.
She's always watching you. Casually, though. Casually. She doesn't have eyes, so it's casual. And so I brought the symbol back to the office, and I'm like, I don't have a big idea, but I have a symbol. And I know that she's easily recognizable across cultures and genders. And then I'm like, I just couldn't shake the shape of her dress.
Cape? Of her cape?
Yeah. So I did. I was like, well, it's a dress, but then I kept thinking that, other things are that shape, and I thought it might be a cape. But then I thought I was a crazy person. So I printed out the vector, and I took a pen, and with a few lines, it's like, she's been there this whole time. We were just looking at her back. And in fact, she's wearing a cape. And so, I brought her back to Sarah, and Sarah's like, it was never a dress. And I'm like, that's genius. So we created this campaign. And by campaign, it sounds like lofty. We made stickers. And I gave a talk about gender equity at a small women in technology conference. And then somebody took a picture of the sticker and said, cannot unsee. And then within 24 hours, every major media outlet company in the entire world picked it up. And the point of this is that it was a moment where we came together. We saw this problem on a larger stage. My boss sort of prompted it, like, let's see. We didn't solve the problem of women in technology, but what we did was we offered another visual representation for women being in the world, that we weren't just like a symbol of the mundane. We're actually like superheroes of the everyday. And not, so anyway, it was really lovely. And what people, to your point, is people were writing in because this symbol wasn't about like being in the workspace specifically. It was about women being in the world and feeling like they had personal agency. And not just women, non-binary folks, people who were like, I don't feel like, I fit in. And this symbol has like said to me, you do fit in. And the symbol became, like their own, like people embraced it in a way that they're like, this is my symbol, and I'm putting a lab coat on it because I'm like, oh my god. So the symbol became way larger than us three on that particular day or during that week. It became the symbol for everyone.
You latched onto something that translated very well across borders. And it was this essentially a figurative representation, a symbol of a human being. And I think finding that fundamental thread for everyone, that thread of the cape, we'll just go with that, allowed you to make that sticker, which stitched all of these different people together and allowed them to then be creative upon how they define that symbol for themselves. And that's almost like, here's the sticker of the little C. Here's this symbol. You choose how you want to make it the big C. And that's up to you for how you want it to shine. I have this androgynous looking symbol. Well, put some hair on it, throw a cape on it, put a lab coat on it. That's up to you. But that's for you within your own identity. But underlying within all of it, right, is the fact that you are a human being and you have that choice to creatively trespass on a symbol that we see every single day, all day throughout the world. And I think that is a spectacularly simple, tiny C that turned out to something so magnificent.
Well, thank you. And thanks for kind of threading all of these ideas together. One thing that I wrote the website for It Was Never Addressed the day before we were to launch it, which we didn't know was going to be a big deal. So, when you're doing something in advance, you're like, it's got to be clear enough that people are like,
Yeah.
what's that? But vague enough that you're like, I don't know what it is. But one thing that was really important to me was that we provided the free lined drawings, and that you could enliven it, design it any way you want. So that was part of the foundation. The rest, we didn't know it was going to go viral. We really didn't know. You never know. People were like, I'm going to create a viral marketing campaign. Good on you. And and most of the times we don't know that a business or a campaign or whatever is going to take off. We hope it serves the people that we intended to serve, and then beyond that, it has a life of its own. So that was really important to me, is that people had the agency to interact with the symbol. And also, something I infuse in a lot of my talks, I gave a big talk to a manufacturing summit, and they're like, what is she doing here? But I took the symbol that they had that represented manufacturing, and I showed them what it looked like upside down, what it looked like on the side, and made them guess, and it looked like these. So it starts to plant the seed that when you're walking into everyday spaces, that your office that you overlook, or a mall, a coffee shop that you go to, and you start to take your brain and go, oh, what would happen if I turn that symbol upside down or inside out? And you're like, there's a whole new world. And once you start to tap into that way of thinking, all bets are off, man. Everything you see becomes fuel and fodder for creative ideas.
So, well, Tania, I want to, we'll ask this last question because I want to be respectful of your time, but I want to ask this. We have a lot of young leaders that listen to this podcast.
Yay!
What would be advice that you would give them? And I kind of want to, and if you don't mind, you could give, whatever advice you want, but also the courage to be able to do this, to take these steps. But, what would you leave with a young leader that's coming into maybe a new tech company or any type of company, and they want to be creative, they want to implement these creative ideas, they want to trespass. Mm-hmm. How could they have the courage to be able to do that?
Two things. One, it's a process. And I can't say this enough. Those of you who are listening and use your body in some way, that there's muscle memory. Like if you run incrementally, your body shows up one day and your mind doesn't get in the way and say, I'm freaked out about running. It just knows what to do. And it's the same thing with creativity. So there are two things for young leaders, especially if you're embedded in a company that you're like, I'm not sure if I can be creative. One, bring a notebook with you. I literally will carry a journal and have carried a journal with me every single day to every single job, no matter how shitty and rigid it is, because this is my safe space, and I can write and work on ideas, whether that's during my lunch break, before work, after work. So bring a space that's safe, a pad and paper and a pen, and use it to write down all of your wonderful, weird ideas. Bam. Two, and this is the thing I had to learn the hard way, somehow, because I was never I always had to create my roles within companies. So I was never really aligned. I never had resources. They never gave me a team. My budget was $1. And so what I realized early on is, oh, wait, I can assemble my own team. And this is important. You might find somebody in accounting, and then somebody in HR, and assemble your own team and have your own meetings that are unsanctioned. So you make sure you check in with people who hold you accountable, challenge you, and also celebrate and encourage your ideas, so that you don't feel lost and alone within a big company. And also, this applies outside of it. A lot of times I couldn't get what I needed within companies, but I needed the money. Right? So I stayed there for a little bit longer. So I had my own team outside of the company. Have a quarterly meeting, have a weekly meeting with people who enliven you, challenge you, and cheer you on the whole way through. You can assemble your own team. I cannot say that enough. A lot of times we feel like work is the place where they give us a team and we're stuck with them. That's bullshit. You can make your own. And so those are the two things I would suggest right off the bat that will keep you fueled. Yeah.
I'm fueled with the fact that we can all assemble our own team as superheroes. And Tania, thank you very much for being a steward of creativity and helping remind human beings everywhere, no matter how entrenched their processes are, that that little piece of creative humanity still resides within you. You just have to get rid of the fear to pull it out.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much for coming on to TartleCast. This message will be heard far and wide, and please continue to be loud, be against the grain, be disruptive, because I think that sets a fine precedent and example for what every human being should strive to be.
And what is your website so that everyone can go on there?
Sure. It's TaniaKatan.com. That's Tania, Tania. Not like the other Tanya with a Y, who's delightful. And then also you could follow me on Instagram, and I am a good time on Instagram, and it's the unreal Tania Katan.
Oh,
because Tania Katan was taken by a mom with 2 kids, and I'm like, do I want to be like, I'm the real Tania Katan and your mom's not? Like,
no, do the inverse.
Start therapy early. Yeah. Yeah. It was a total pleasure. You guys are amazing human beings. Thank you so much for inviting me on. I appreciate it.